All right, we'll pick this up here. So we had just discussed these particular drugs, and my comment is that if dopamine is a relatively feel-good neurotransmitter for us, it makes us stand upright, it gives us some level of confidence and openness or perhaps aggressiveness. Inhibiting those receptors doesn't seem great to me. Now I can see where inhibiting a dopamine 2 receptor could make somebody less sort of approach oriented and less aggressive, and that might make us feel better but may not make the patient feel better. There's also this issue of dopamine has multiple different receptors with different affinities, and if dopamine levels get particularly high, they may actually participate in the dissociation process when their lower affinity receptors get saturated. So on that level, maybe inhibiting that particular low affinity receptor might decrease dissociation and perhaps decrease the tendency towards hallucinations. But even so, it still arguably doesn't make a lot of sense that we want to inhibit a dopamine, a kind of feel-good neurotransmitter. Now, some of these older ones have been demonstrated to be able to reduce pro-inflammatory catabolic cytokines. So perhaps that's actually how they're benefiting the patient, and the dopamine receptor side effects that we see potentially might have very little to do with how they're benefiting the patient, but they may have absolutely to do with the adverse side effects we see with these medications, and they can be severe, and they don't make the patients feel better. So that's another issue with those. Now we get down to these newer ones that inhibit dopamine 2 receptors, and the serotonin 2A receptors inhibit those too. And I think this is interesting. Serotonin is also a feel-good neurotransmitter. But what we found out was when you give somebody LSD, it sits on this receptor and really jacks it up and activates it, so people hallucinate. Now, we're starting to understand that with LSD, some of those hallucinations can actually be sort of therapeutic, or psilocybin, or ketamine, probably a different receptor, but those hallucinations can actually have perhaps some therapeutic benefit. But we're also starting to understand that those drugs dramatically drop pro-inflammatory cytokines, and that might be their healing benefit. But to chronically inhibit serotonin receptors with the thought that they are responsible for hallucinations, when serotonin is relatively a feel-good, calming neurotransmitter, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. So again, this also will drop pro-inflammatory cytokines. So what we may be seeing again with this drug is their therapeutic benefit is from dropping the pro-inflammatory cytokines and stopping kind of this cluster up here of shutting down the brain, and that it really has very little to do with this receptor. In fact, sitting on this receptor might actually be making people feel slightly worse, and perhaps a little more docile, so we're more comfortable with them, but they aren't getting better and they're feeling worse, at least from this receptor strategy. So I'm throwing that out there, kind of dropping that bomb that that yes, I am questioning that, and as I've questioned stuff in other talks. So now let's go to this half of the board, and I don't need to run the threats again. I just want to mention that when we treat this in a biopsychosocial fashion, so when we're treating any emotional threat, attack, past trauma, social threat, attack, past trauma, financial threat, attack, past trauma, when we're treating all of these predictive codes, traumatic memories, when we're using expressive therapy to offload our repressions and expressions, when we're doing emotional awareness and integration, and we're dropping our overall threat load and moving ourselves into safety, we're going to see a natural healing response. So we can't ignore any of this And this demands good public policy if we're going to cure these mental health issues, and schizophrenia arguably being the most severe and impairing one. So I want to re-emphasize that we have to move people into a place of safety. Safe, seen, secure, right? But now moving over to some of the things that might be helpful is, in this case, I would not, argue for this for COVID. I think it might be appropriate for certain neurodegenerative disorders like the Alzheimer type dementia and the frontal temporal lobe dementias. But prazosin is an alpha-1 adrenergic blocker. And so what it can do is it is the alpha-1 adrenergic receptors up in the cortex of the brain that dramatically drop the perfusion to the brain under threat, and not to the whole brain, to the neocortical brain, the part that is kind of under attack in schizophrenia, but also in some of the dementias. So arguably, prazosin might be very helpful, and we know prazosin is actually pretty helpful for people with PTSD, which is another threat-stress response that has similar cortical atrophy to schizophrenia. So I would argue for some prazosin at night, and prazosin may even be able to modify the tendency towards dissociation and hallucinations, probably primarily through better blood flow, but there may be another mechanism. Again, sleep is super important, and schizophrenics have markedly disrupted sleep. And we just talked about that the pro-inflammatory cytokines prevent tryptophan from going to serotonin and going to melatonin, and that may be part of the reason why their sleep cycle is so screwed up, but also secreting pro-inflammatory cytokines will do that, and so will higher levels of cortisol. They'll disrupt your sleep cycle. So trying to re-regulate sleep is very important, and I think good doses of melatonin. There's other things we can do to get melatonin out, like staying away from TV screens and things like that at night as well. Again, all of these vitamins, the vitamin Bs, particularly I like vitamin B3, but vitamin C, vitamin D, and vitamin K2 all drop pro-inflammatory cytokines and have effects on these pro-inflammatory inflammasomes that we create that take resources from cells to create those fat resources to create an inflammasome. So if we decrease the production of those, that helps as well. We always talk about magnesium, or we can even talk about magnesiums. There's different forms of it, are very important. They drop pro-inflammatory cytokines, but they also are good for vasodilatation and keeping blood flow to these parts of the brain. So magnesium is very important. Zinc, when we're under threat stress, we tend to burn a lot of zinc, and frequently people get zinc deficient, and zinc is very important for enzymes that cleave up pro-inflammatory cytokines, cleave up angiotensin II, and they also are very important for the production of anti-inflammatory and anabolic cytokines. So we've got to keep a normal zinc level. Now, you don't want too much zinc because it can get toxic, so it's not an endless supplement, but it's important to have a little extra zinc if you are under threat and stress, and arguably schizophrenics are under extreme threat and stress, so zinc could be very helpful for them. We're going to talk about the cholinergics again and their role. Again, the cholinergic system is our natural anti-inflammatory system. It is not cortisol. That is a stress hormone. Our cholinergic system is our natural anti-inflammatory system, and it is also part of our anabolic or tissue repair building system. So it is governed in the body quite a bit by the vagal system. In this case, we're talking about both the dorsal motor nucleus and the nucleus ambiguus that contribute to the vagal nerve and put out these great little chemicals into our body to downregulate the pro-inflammatory and catabolic cytokines and upregulate the anti-inflammatory and anabolic cytokines. So we do have some drugs that can help with that. Urocholine is a cheap old drug that sits on cholinergic receptors. We've talked about nicotine, and nicotine has profound effects on nicotinic acetylcholine receptors. And we know that nicotine, although it is addicting, is very neuroprotective. And if you look at most schizophrenics, they've already figured it out. They all smoke. Now, it's terrible for their lungs and it can be terrible for their vascular system, but the nicotine is good to protect the brain because it's stimulating that cholinergic system to produce anti-inflammatory and anabolic cytokines, not only in their brain, but in their body. So many schizophrenics self-medicate with nicotine. They've figured it out. And we got a good, fatty acid. When we're talking about, diets and fatty acids, you can supplement phosphatidylcholine. That's a good fatty acid, not only for energy production, but provides choline to combine with acetyl-CoA and pops out acetylcholine as that really good neurotransmitter we want. So under that category, we've already talked about, the vagal system, these two nuclei in the brain, dorsal motor nucleus, ambiguous, and their contributions to the vagal system, and the vagus nerve, the wandering nerve that goes all over the body and makes us feel good, puts us into feed, breed, digest, and rest mode. So there's a number of things you can do for vagal stimulation. So in general, there are things that kind of feel good. It's pleasant visions, it's nice smells, and we know that actually some of the plant oil smells that we all gravitate to, lavender, rosemary, things like that, they actually drop pro-inflammatory cytokine levels just by smelling them. So good smells, good food, good touch, touch that feels good, massage can activate that. Certain parts of our body, skin being stimulated or pressure points being stimulated can activate the vagal system. And that kind of goes on and on. Social interaction, healthy social interaction, where we feel safe, activates our vagal system. And so that's important. There are vagal stimulators out there in the world, and some of them work acoustically, some work on certain areas, skin, the earlobe in particular. There are some that are superficial electrical stim, and you can actually have a neurosurgeon implant one on your vagus nerve too, which I'm not recommending, but in severe cases maybe you would consider that. So vagal stim is important, and all of these things, all of these threat modifiers increase vagal tone in the body. We've talked a lot about ketogenic diet, or something close to it, kind of an anti-inflammatory diet, but the process of at least having a 12-hour fast in the case of a schizophrenic overnight, so that we go into ketosis when we're sleeping, hopefully sleeping, because that's when we do a lot of repair and we build back up our neurotransmitters, we build back up our hormones, we build back up our tissues, we repair the brain, the neurons, and the glial tissues when we're in that fasting state overnight and we're burning ketones. So, glucose is okay during the day when we're scrambling around. Try to keep it to a minimum, but we need to have that overnight fast. We need to get good sleep, including a good fast to allow ketogenesis and the ketones to come out and drop our pro-inflammatory catabolic cytokines, raise our anti-inflammatory anabolic cytokines, and our body to repair itself. So that's important. I always put aspirin up as a baby aspirin, just because when you're having the pro-inflammatory cytokines circulating in your body, vasoconstriction in certain sites, right? You can be getting some high blood pressure and endothelial damage, and you're at increased risk for clogging up your blood vessels, and aspirin can help with that as well as dampen the inflammation. Again, DHEA is part of the anabolic hormone pathway. The stress hormones are cortisol and aldosterone, and the more anabolic type hormones are testosterone, estrogen, progesterone. DHEA is kind of the starting point for a lot of those hormones. Another very important hormone is oxytocin. It's our love hormone. It helps us bond with other people. It's an endogenous analgesic painkiller, basically, and it's also anabolic, and it helps us to repair tissues. Wound healing is dramatically faster on people who have high oxytocin levels, and we did put its sort of evil twin over here, vasopressin, that kind of does the opposite. That's part of the stress response. So we can supplement those without really any significant side effects. The tetracyclines that we brought up, not only for treating COVID cytokine storms, but we brought it up in treating Alzheimer's. The tetracyclines, particularly minocycline, is the one that's been studied the most. It is helpful in dementias, and it has been shown to be helpful in schizophrenia as well. So minocycline is a good one to drop the pro-inflammatory cytokines and drop the chaos and sort of the destruction that's going on up here in the brain. And as I always talk about, we can go to the big guns, right? Interleukin 6 is a big player in this. It is probably the major player in terms of the cytokines in schizophrenia, causing all these things that we talked about. And we do have interleukin 6 inhibitors, and I would argue in severe schizophrenia, that makes a lot more sense to me than blocking dopamine and serotonin transmission. So just throw that out there. And then, we've got other ones too. We've got tumor necrosing factor alpha inhibitors that look like they would be promising. Those levels are always the same ones, are elevated. Interleukin 1 inhibition or interleukin 17 inhibition might have a role. I squeeze this one in here in between because this is one that we haven't really addressed, and it probably belongs up here, but it also belongs in the big gun section. This A7 nicotinic acetylcholine agonist. So this acts on acetylcholine receptors. So it's a drug, it's a pharmaceutical that behaves like nicotine. I don't know that much about it. I don't know if it would have addicting properties like nicotine, but it has been shown to be effective in treating schizophrenia. And arguably, it would be effective in treating a COVID cytokine storm as well, or arguably it would be effective in treating dementias as well, and a lot of stuff probably. And we'll just briefly go down here into the phosphodiesterase inhibitors. I think it's always a good idea to keep an eye on these because they may have the potential to drop all of the pro-inflammatory cytokines together in a graded response, and they may have some promise. They need to be figured out first, and dosing needs to be figured out, but some of them are fairly benign. And phosphodiesterase inhibitor 5s are the things like Viagra, which have been well tolerated and probably actually would even help not only dropping pro-inflammatory cytokines, but perhaps help with the vascular issue in some of these mental health issues and neurodegenerative disorders. And then, we kind of just briefly touched on ketamine and psilocybin, and you go, well, why would you do that? These people are already dissociated and already having hallucinations, and isn't that just going to make them worse? Yeah, maybe. That's certainly a possibility. I think if you couldn't get these people into a place of feeling safe and you induced hallucinations in them, that might not be great, right? Because those hallucinations will probably be biased towards threat and be kind of scary. But we're starting to understand that these things may have therapeutic benefits, and even if they have scary hallucinations, they can profoundly drop the pro-inflammatory and catabolic cytokines, and that might be something to look at down the road, is do they have a role? And I wouldn't rule them out. So they're up there with question marks, but they deserve to be on the list based on their pharmacology and neurophysiology, what they do. Naltrexone is another one that we think we talked about it with MS, but anyway, naltrexone actually antagonizes opioid receptors, and weirdly, opioids are not part of our pleasure reward system. They are part of our stress response. They increase pro-inflammatory cytokines, and if you look at all their side effects, they exactly line up with the physiology of a threat-stress response. So the naltrexone blocking their activity might have an effect, but more importantly, naltrexone also drops pro-inflammatory cytokines, including in the glial tissues of the brain and in the fascial tissues. And it's being looked at in MS. It has showed some promise in less, less worrisome diseases, kind of the more benign diseases like fibromyalgia. But it deserves to be mentioned. And then finally, we're down here to, kind of our typical supplements that, you kind of go, well, why not throw them in? Glutathione, N-acetylcysteine, and alpha-lipoic acid that we know drop pro-inflammatory cytokines. And, if you're getting a good diet, you probably don't need them, but they probably won't hurt. So we kind of throw them at the bottom of this. Okay, so good. So in summary, schizophrenia is a biopsychosocial problem. We cannot cure it unless we address all of these possible threats and address them aggressively, which we don't. We don't have an adequate healthcare system. We have an illness care system based on revenue production, not on people's health and wellness. We have a more inadequate mental health and addiction recovery system in place. So this needs to really be looked at if we're going to cure a lot of the ills of society, including severe schizophrenia. But we know the number of schizophrenics that are homeless, and the majority of people who are on the street and homeless have had all of these things, particularly in this kind of spiritual category. They've had significant attacks and traumas, and that the majority of people on the street who are homeless are suffering from mental illness and addiction. No real fault of their own, right? This is not about brain defects or character defects. This is about a society who fails to look after the safety of their citizens. That's what this is about. So we got to take care of all of this stuff if we're going to be able to heal the schizophrenic, as well as people who have, less afflicting mental illnesses. If we're going to kind of change the dynamics of our culture and our society for the better. So I think that's probably all I've got to say on this for today. Thank you.